Welcome back to our Elul liturgical reflections. This has been a journey through the month of Elul using pieces of liturgy that were written by our members, particularly in 2020 and 2021. Our piece of liturgy today, which is called A Prayer, comes from Rachel Kowarski. Each day I awake in the shadow of a world that I do not recognize. The voices of Israel break through the din and wrap around me, like the smoke of a furnace beneath a quaking mountain. I hear the voices of Nadav and Avihu as we search for answers to new questions. The voice of Shalomit when our children cannot be protected. Of Korach as our leaders dine atop mountains while their people cry out in fear. Each day I awake in the shadow of Sinai. In a desert, scary in unfamiliarity. I remember Israel trembled and stumbled and feared. But Israel also heard and remembered and taught her children. I hear the voices of Bezalel and Oholiav when there are no experiences to learn from. Of Miriam as I watch our waters rise. Of Jethro when the burden seems too great. Each day I awake, and the racket of our world is loud, but the horns of Sinai are louder. It's another extraordinary piece of liturgy. I'll share some information, and then I'll share some of my thoughts about this. The voices of Nadav and Avihu, these are Aaron's sons who offer a strange and alien fire, and who are immediately killed for it because they offer improper worship at the altar. Shalomit, the voice of Shalomit. This was a really interesting reference for Rachel to bring in. This is from Leviticus chapter 24, verse 11. Shalomit is the mother of the blasphemer, who was blasphemed in the camp and who therefore is stoned to death. And Korach is the leader who rebels against Moses just after the episode of the spies and the people are despondent. Korach rises up and tries to essentially take over the leadership of the Jewish people in an act of rebellion, which is viewed very negatively by rabbinic sources. And then in the second verse, I hear the voices of Bezalel and Oholiav, when there is no experience to learn from. These are the individuals who are imbued with the knowledge and wisdom of how to build the tabernacle. They don't have experience that they learned from others, it's given to them by God. When Rachel refers to Miriam, who she says, as I watch our waters rise, Miriam is held as responsible for the people having water during the time of the wilderness, during the time in the desert. As soon as Miriam dies, there is no water, and so the rabbis make a connection. So Miriam has always been very strongly connected with water. Indeed, when we go out after Havdalah, there was a tradition for some women who were gathering water, because they couldn't do so during Shabbat, for some women who were gathering water to mention Miriam in a prayer. And Jethro is Moses' father-in-law, who before the Sinai account, Moses has taken on way too much, and Jethro is his father-in-law who turns around and says, you need to learn to delegate. So in this extraordinary prayer, Rachel mentions 3 different times of waking up. In the first verse, she says, each day I awake in the shadow of a world I do not recognize. In the second, she says, each day I awake in the shadow of Sinai. And in the third, she says, each day I awake and the racket of our world is loud. It was a very noisy, confusing time during the pandemic, particularly at the beginning. It was a world that we really didn't recognize. And yet, we're always waking up in the shadow of Sinai. This is how I read this passage. The voices of Israel break through the din and wrap around me. This idea, as she says, like the smoke of a furnace beneath the quaking mountain. The idea of the Sinai account was actually quite a terrifying account. And it awoke us from our slumber to the point that the Israelites turn to Moses and say, this is too much, it's too terrifying for us. You have to get the revelation on Sinai, not us. I find it fascinating, wonderful, that in the first verse, in this place of the shadow of a world that I do not recognize, that Rachel brings in the voices of Nadav and Avihu, Shalomit and Korach, seen in some sense as rebels, or those who did not do what they were told. Or, in Shalomit's case, Shalomit is really interesting because it's not her who blasphemes, it's her son. But, of course, the rabbis turn around in some midrashim and say, essentially, had she been a better mother, she would have been able to make sure that her son did not blaspheme. Others go the other way, actually, and speak very positively of her. But Rachel starts this shadow of a world that we do not recognize with the voices of rebellion, disagreement, with the voices of alternative voices, I think, is another way to look at this. Voices that fall outside the mainstream. But, and I think there's also a political critique, and I should check with Rachel here. I think there's a political critique here. The voice of Shalomit when our children cannot be protected. I believe this is a commentary about violence, and violence that is expressed in America. That's how I read it, certainly. Which goes next into of Korach, as our leaders dine atop mountains while their people cry out in fear. This separation, the way I read it, this separation of lawmakers from the populace, and a critique of contemporary society. But then, even though we then move, as we move into the second verse, this desert, scary and unfamiliarity, it also moves into something very positive. I remember Israel trembled and stumbled and feared, but Israel also heard and remembered and taught her children. Na'asem v'nishma, we will do and we will hear, say the Israelites at Sinai. We will do whatever is told of us, and we will hear and we will listen. We commit ourselves, basically, to moving forward. So even though in the past we may have trembled and stumbled and feared, at the same time we've also heard and remembered and taught. And I think that's really important for us during the month of Elul, because we all tremble and stumble and fear. But that's not what the month of Elul is about. Yes, it's about being aware of when we stumbled, but then what do we do with that? We remember the mistakes that we made, and then we move on, we teach. And there really is a real balance here, these three verbs, trembled, stumbled, feared, which mirrors heard, remembered, and taught. And I really like the idea of hearing our tradition during the month of Elul, hearing others when they say that they believe that we've made some mistakes and we need to change ourselves. Remembering that which others have said to us, remembering what we have done to others, and then teaching, going out, changing ourselves, making ourselves be a practical example, which helps us teach others by our example. And then hearing the voices, moving from those alternate voices to the more institutional, established voices, perhaps. The voices of Betzalel and Oholiav, builders. The voice of Miriam, the sustainer. The voice of Jethro, the organizer. And so these final two lines, each day I awake and the racket of our world is loud, but the horns of Sinai are louder. I love this as we move towards Rosh Hashanah, because it's so easy for us to get distracted in this world. There are many people who say that our society is organized in such a way so as to deliberately distract us. And nonetheless, there is a call, the call of the shofar, the horns of Sinai are louder than that, if only we were to listen to them, to really hear, to actively want to hear them. Each day I awake and the racket of our world is loud. As soon as we wake up, the noise from outside just infiltrates our everyday life. But the horns of Sinai are louder. They call to us for teshuvah. They call to us to find our true self. I think this is a really important passage as we get close to the end of the month of Elul. We awake in the shadow of a world that we do not recognize. That is each day differently. We awake in the shadow of Sinai. We are pulled in two differing directions, in the direction of the secular world and in the direction of the religious world. And in Reformed Judaism, we aim to bring these two together, to celebrate our religion in a world that has that noise and racket, but we still listen carefully to the shofar, which calls us to account. The blessing before hearing the shofar, Lishmoa kol shofar, thanking God who commands us to hear the voice of the shofar. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lishmoa kol shofar. I hope you have a wonderful day, a day of hearing the differing voices, the racket of our world and the horn of Sinai, those two different voices calling to us. And I hope it's a day in which you make a choice to hear that horn of the shofar, a choice to awake in the shadow of Sinai, a choice to hear, to remember, and to teach by our deeds. Have a wonderful day.